moderator and the speaker are from certain caste, definitely people will actually start criticizing about the topic that I have chosen for this 25th webinar.
Brahmins are equally the citizens of this country, and they have a right to their opinions, they have a right to their way of life, and they have a
The fact is, most of the people are were forced to move out of India because of reservation.
Why are you and I in India still?
Let us assume for a minute that Mr. X is coming under general category.
when you look at reservation, when you look at persecution, when you look at injustice, you are certainly looking at a community level argument. That the downfall of Hinduism started when the Brahmin decided to leave his traditional vocation and decided to learn English to climb the social ladder. The Justice Party movement, as well as the self-respect movement, was predominantly an anti-Brahmin movement and not a pro-Dalit movement or a pro-SC/ST movement. And the reason is,
I welcome you all with my love, respect and regards. I am Anand Kumar, advocate practicing in Delhi High Court. I am going to be your host and the moderator for today's session. On behalf of my team, AP Legal Chambers, and on my personal behalf, I welcome you all to our Silver Jubilee 25th webinar of the series titled Caste and Reservation under the Constitution by our special speaker, Advocate Sai Deepak, Supreme Court of India. We started our webinar series on Thursday, the 28th of May 2020, with Mr. Sai graciously inaugurating our first session. And since then, with our participants' continuous support and patronage, we had the honor of hosting the sharpest, brightest, and the greatest minds of law and related fields. We had the privilege of having on board former Union Minister, two former retired judges of High Courts, Additional Solicitor General of India, two senior advocates, three advocates on records, 10 eminent advocates practicing in various courts, a distinguished professor, an erudite historian, a registered dietitian, and a lovely Indic Renaissance couple who have come and graced the webinar with their presentations. We started organizing webinars out of our passion for law, and when we started, we had no clue as to how and where to take it forward. We did not have any special preparations. We just started a Facebook page and a YouTube channel. And now, with God's grace and your affection, we have 1000 plus followers in our FB page and over 500 subscribers for our YouTube channel. We are mere facilitators. In fact, we are just setting up a stage for the special speaker to connect with our participants and vice versa. You people have made it possible with your support and love. Those who are attending our webinars regularly, you might be knowing us. For those who have come here for the first time, we are Team AP Legal Chambers, a new age law firm in Delhi NCR with a branch office in Chennai. Things started to fall in place in 2017, and we are since then we are trying to resolve the legal issues of our clients to the best of our abilities. APLC has been providing specialized services in the areas of domestic and international taxation, constitutional laws, IPR, energy laws, commercial advisory, arbitration, and corporate compliances. I would like to make a few things clear before we go ahead with the session. Kindly mute your audios and if possible, disable the videos too. The session is a completely moderated session, and once the presentation of our special speaker gets over, APLC's APLC and the question answer session in a new segment would follow, in a new format would follow. As always, once the speaker's presentation gets over, we shall be having the segment called APLC's APLC, Ask the Popular Learned Council. We have prepared a few questions from our end and we would be asking them to our special speaker. I am sure this will be both interesting and informative. We have special goodies and giveaways. As a token of appreciation and gratitude, we shall be giving 3 special goodies to our 3 of our regular participants who have attended most of our webinars till date. We are also going to give 2 special prizes for 2 best questions asked during the webinar. So, aim and shoot sharp questions to our special speaker to stand a chance to win the special prizes. In today's webinar, we shall be covering an interesting and pertinent topic, caste and reservation in India. Caste and reservation are both controversial words which have far-reaching consequences in social, economic, and political spheres. Caste is the foundation on which our society is built. A person's caste is decided on the basis of his or her birth. One can convert religion if he wants to, but one cannot convert caste. Caste has cast a magic spell over the people, and we keep demanding reservation based on caste. Even after 7 decades after independence, the word reservation reverberates positive and negative vibrations in the minds of people. Right to equality is a fundamental right guaranteed by our Constitution. As per Article 15 of the Constitution of India, the state shall not discriminate against any citizen on the grounds of religion, race, caste, sex, place of birth, or any of them. Then the question comes, why reservation? AP Legal Chambers today tries to find out the reason why our founding fathers chose to include reservation in first place. We have people for and against reservation. There are other schools of thoughts as well, like domicile-based reservation, economically backward people's reservation, gender-based reservation, etc. Why reservation is essential and why we have to be critical about abolishing reservation are the topics to be discussed in detail. APLC dissects the caste and reservation and see the other options available in our armory. The data published by our government has been misleading and leaves the ground reality. We will also see the caste and reservation from the political point of view as well. Why is it important for the political parties? What is its relevance and the need for us to discuss about the caste and reservation now? So, with this basic introduction, AP Legal Chambers has decided to hear it out from our special speaker who has extensive knowledge in this subject. I take immense pleasure in introducing our special speaker of today, Shri Sai Deepak ji. A short bio about our special speaker. Mr. Sai Deepak is an engineer turned law firm partner turned arguing counsel. He founded Law Chambers of J. Sai Deepak and set up practice as an arguing counsel. He is engaged by soliciting law firms and individual solicitors to appear before the Honorable Supreme Court of India, the Delhi High Court, the Bombay High Court, the Madras High Court, the Competition Commission of India, the Competition Appellate Tribunal, the Intellectual Property Appellate Board, and tax tribunals. In a decade's practice, Mr. Sai has carved a niche for himself in civil, commercial litigation, IP litigation, information technology law, competition law, constitutional law, and indirect taxation. Sai has advised, represented, and argued for clients in diverse domains such as the pharmaceutical industries, e-commerce, and telecom sector. In July 2018, Sai's argument on behalf of ready-to-wait women campaigners in the Sabarimala Ayyappa Temple's petition before a constitutional bench of the Supreme Court was widely acclaimed. Since November 2016, Mr. Sai has been engaged by the Department of Industrial Policy and Promotion, Ministry of Commerce, Government of India, as an honorary advisor on the implementation of the national IPR policy. With this basic introduction about the topic and also about our special speaker, I hand over the session to Mr. Sai to take over and deliver today's webinar. Thank you, and over to you, Ji.
Thank you, Anand, for this warm welcome and this generous introduction. So the reason why I chose this particular topic is because this topic has been in the news over the last few weeks or perhaps more than a month, especially in the context of certain discussions that I've been having regularly with respect to temple freedom, so on and so forth. So I thought it was important to address this issue, not just from the standpoint of history, but also from the standpoint of constitution, and introduce a bit of history to those who look at it exclusively from the standpoint of the constitution. So that's the reason that I chose this particular topic. Now, quite a few things that were said by Anand as part of his opening remarks have been accepted as perhaps the premises and perhaps as truisms and facts whenever we discuss issues with respect to caste. One, that it is birth-based. Two, that caste is immutable and can never be changed. Three, that you can change your religion, but you can't change your caste. These are certain aspects that I think are fundamentally meant to be examined, because these are the very same premises, or these are the very same accepted notions which seem to have formed the basis, or which, at least on the face of it, seem to have formed the basis for the position that the framers of the Constitution took with respect to caste and reservations under the Indian Constitution. I have had the opportunity to hear better informed speakers on the issue of caste. I have had the opportunity to share the panel with them on several occasions in the recent past. And that tells me that perhaps we may have modeled the concept of caste significantly in the process of using certain English terms to understand the basic nature of this particular form of social organization. Let me set out 2 or 3 points at the outset, broad points, which may help set the tone for my talk. May I request everybody else to kindly switch off your microphones if that's okay with you. Otherwise, it causes a lot of disturbance and it affects my flow of thought. So, point number 1, whether caste is defined or is described by Varna or Jati, that is something that needs to be understood. Because the more and more we try to understand the nature of the social organization, Hindu social organization, from the standpoint of, let's say, the manner in which the British man understood it and the manner in which he made sense of this particular stratification, I believe that we will be committing a significant amount of mistake, just as we would be making a lot of mistake in using the word religion for the purposes of understanding Indic faith systems or Indian dharmas, so to speak, or Indian panths, so to speak. So if caste as a word does not aptly describe this particular form of social organization, what is it that describes it best? What comes closest? There are 2 words that are constantly used in Indian languages whenever the question of caste comes about. It's either Jati Dharma or Varna Dharma, Varna or Jati. Now, unfortunately, I think even Indians perhaps have not understood the difference between Jati and Varna enough. So I have had the opportunity to talk to a few acharyas, so to speak. There is a bit of disturbance, I think. Yes, thank you, please. I've had the opportunity to discuss this issue with a couple of acharyas to understand what the traditional position is with respect to Varna and Jati. In fact, I went a step further and even made and asked this question: if Varna is different from Jati and Jati is different from Kula, what are the 3 kinds of distinctions? And as people who are experts on this particular subject, and at the very least are certainly way more informed than I am on this particular subject, I have no reason to doubt what they had to submit on this, because it was based on their reading of the scripture and their extensive understanding of Indian history and Indian schools of thought. And what I was told was that as far as Kula is concerned, it translates largely to the word clan and is perhaps a cultural stratification, or perhaps a family-based stratification, or a group-based stratification, which has got perhaps nothing to do with Varna or Jati. So Kula largely translates to lineage. and not necessarily tied up to or tied with jati or varna. Jati is obviously birth based, and jati has a significant amount of, let's say, relationship with perhaps the profession and birth, both going hand in hand. Because before the industrial revolution, the pre industrial society was largely a stratified society where occupations were necessarily the sole preserve of certain families and certain groups, and therefore if you were born of a certain family or in a certain family, it was assumed without any doubt that your traditional occupation was so and so. Therefore, whether you call it occupation based or birth based, at the relevant point in time when you're discussing the concept of jati, practically there is not too much of a difference. If jati is birth based and is also perhaps related to the occupation, then what is the relationship between jati and varna? And he had a brilliant answer for this, which is to say that varna is more of a spiritual stratification based on guna, which is to say based on the fundamental assumption that the nature of human being of all classes, of all societies, of all races can be broadly basketed, so to speak, or split into 4 different baskets. And that is where he draws basically the position that those people who are rulers of the mind, or who are ruled by the mind, so to speak, and who are driven more by the mind, so to speak, will be treated as Brahmins. And those who effectively wield the sword, or who happen to be the ones who wield their arms, so to speak, would translate to Kshatriyas. And those who are creators of wealth will translate to Vaishyas. And those who effectively work with their hands and who also, let's say, support all the 3 other castes in the rest of the society through every other form of activity would translate to Shudras. Unfortunately, what has happened, and this is something that he happened to address this very, very clearly, is that the word Shudra has acquired such a negative connotation thanks to perhaps our own misinterpretation and the manner in which we have looked down upon certain professions, that the word Shudra today has become almost at par with a slur. It is almost treated at par with a cuss word. Unfortunately, if you look at the books which deal with the Varnashrama Dharma, none of these 4 castes are seen as being dispensable or as being inferior in one way or the other. The indispensability of all 4 forms of human natures for the running of a society has been accepted, not just for the Indian society, but across the world, to basically make the point that regardless of which race you come from, which society you come from, which civilization you come from, you will always have people who will perform certain tasks which are meant for the rest of the society and which help the rest of the society, but who are more driven by their work in terms of work done through their hands as opposed to being driven by the mind. And those who see themselves as intellectuals, those who are in the business of imparting education or, let's say, production of knowledge, will always be at the top of the social ladder. This is something that, whether we agree with it or not, or whether we allow our politically correct notions to inform our understanding of this particular issue or not, the fact remains that even in current day society, with all its trappings of modernity, all its trappings of being a progressive, liberal, and whatnot society, we certainly look up to those people who are positioned and celebrated as intellectuals. And none of these intellectuals or the rest of the society can run their lives without the support of the plumber, the mechanic, the electrician, everyone. We need everyone in our lives. So we may have a problem with certain names or certain terms being imputed to certain groups of people, but the fact remains that in terms of the stratification of the society, not much has changed, which is to basically say that perhaps a certain jati occupies a certain position in the Varna system at a relevant point in time based on the characteristics that they display and the profession that they decide to perform. But over a point of time, the same jati may perhaps change from one varna to another. And that's perhaps the reason why sometimes the nature of profession or the nature of respect that is given to a certain jati, so to speak, has varied depending on the time frame of history that you're effectively looking at. Please remember, the one thing that I'm going to be very, very clear about and very, very candid about here is, I am not going to make a statement which is necessarily politically correct or populist only to satisfy certain leanings of the members of the audience. I'm merely stating what is it that I have learned so far and which I'm in the process of learning. So the idea is not to hurt sentiments or to create a justification for any abominable practice. All I'm trying to say is, when you look at history and you look at human evolution and when you look at the evolution of a certain society, it is possible for us to today sit and effectively say, my ancestors were wrong and we are better off. However, it would be fundamentally wrong on our part to understand this in such a fashion, because value systems as well as societal evolution keeps changing. Assume for a moment that a certain society continues to observe a certain practice which was observed perhaps in the 1500s and 1600s, even today, without explaining the rationale behind the observance of the certain practice in contemporary society. That would certainly amount to practicing something that is outdated and anachronistic. However, I'm certainly not from that particular school of thought which takes the position that something that is old must necessarily be jettisoned and junked and discarded. I need reasons to say what is acceptable and what is not. Age is no reason for me to discard something. So, which is why when you listen to whatever is it that I have to say, my request would be, because I've seen the kind of reaction sometimes I get on this particular topic, and it's sad that people latch on to sentiments and emotions more than facts, or at least try and understand the rationale behind certain positions before they form their opinions on these issues. And the reason why I'm touching hot potato issues such as caste is because I think it's time that this particular society has an open discussion on questions relating to caste, without airbrushing anything, without pixelating any atrocity that has been committed in the name of caste. And I'm very, very clear that you have to strike a distinction between caste and casteism. Unless and until you strike this particular distinction, you're bound to come to this particular conclusion that the very existence of the construct of caste leads to casteism, and therefore, in order for casteism to be eradicated, caste must also be eradicated. And if that logic were to be applied, then all forms of religion, all forms of identity too will need to be destroyed, because then it is possible to make the argument that religion leads to religious discrimination, therefore let's kill every religious identity. If you kill religious identity and you kill caste-based identity, I'm asking myself, which other form of identity do you think is justified in its existence? Then we can again make the argument that the existence of gender is the reason for gender inequality and gender discrimination, therefore let's kill the concept of gender altogether and let's not have any concept of a gender at all. That, I think, would lead to, frankly speaking, absurdity and absolute chaos, which I don't think really helps the cause. So strike a distinction between the baby and the bathwater. Try not to throw the baby out with the bathwater. Assume for a moment that a certain form of societal organization or social organization is no more relevant, whether you take a position or not. Circumstances, the nature of urbanization, the nature of globalization, economics, cultural practices, individual changes, individual tastes will automatically render a lot of these social structures redundant and infructuous. So, for instance, I keep asking this question on and off. In urban societies, at least in the cities that we live today, I don't say that caste and casteism don't exist. Both of them exist. However, for all practical purposes, the role of caste has come down to specifically only in deciding marital arrangements, and that too, and perhaps in limited families today. Beyond that, caste does not have too much of a role. Where does caste actually have a role to play today? Caste has a role to play in every institution where the constitution has decided that caste-based reservations and caste-based affirmative actions must be in place. And fortunately or unfortunately, if people have a problem with, let's say, birth-based caste as a notion, they have to recognize that even the constitution seems to recognize caste affirmative actions only on the basis of birth. It's not as if that today the constitution has taken a progressive position where it allows people to change their caste. It doesn't make that argument at all. You're allowed to be an atheist, but are you allowed to be a casteless person? Are you allowed to basically say, I have no caste in a certificate? That is something that we still don't see. In fact, without even getting into constitutional history beyond the point, look at the constitution from this end to that end, and you will find any number of provisions that effectively prevent any ban on entry on the basis of untouchability. They abolish untouchability. They provide for caste-based reservations. They provide for provisions which say that there shall not be discrimination on the basis of caste. But there is not a single provision despite Dr. Ambedkar being the chairman of the drafting committee of the Constitution, which calls for abolition of the caste system itself. So, my simple question would be, if Dr. Ambedkar has taken or had taken a position against caste as a system, absolutely, and which is something that he has captured in several books, what is it that ultimately happened during the framing of the Constitution when he had the opportunity perhaps to push the argument that let's do away with the concept of caste altogether? Now, there what has happened is, if you look at all the discussions that have happened between Dr. Ambedkar and Mr. Gandhi and during that entire situation, where Mr. Ambedkar was, rather Dr. Ambedkar was actually asking for separate electorates based on, let's say, the Dalit identity or the untouchable identity or the SC/ST identity. Ultimately, a compromise was worked out where, as opposed to having separate electorates, there were reservations and reserved seats that were created. And therefore, Dr. Ambedkar took the position that those people who have been at the receiving end of caste-based discrimination must have a fair shot at some kind of, let's say, affirmative action, which he decides to put in the form of reservation, so to speak. So notwithstanding the fact that he may believe that caste is fundamentally inhuman, that caste ultimately corrupts and caste ultimately renders people to the level of subhuman species and whatnot, he did not take a position legally when the Constitution was being drafted that at some stage the Indian state must consider even abolishing caste. He may have kept a certain moratorium period for the purposes of abolition of caste-based reservation, but there is no moratorium period that even he has envisaged for the purposes of abolition of caste. So, for the sake of this and to give this particular discussion certain constitutional pegs and certain historical pegs, I'm going to share with members of the audience certain reports, certain documents which they may peruse and read at their own leisure, so that they have a clear picture of what does history actually say. Because we try and form our opinions based on, let's say, popular media, as opposed to seeing what the primary document itself says, and without asking whether a certain position taken by a gentleman such as Dr. Ambedkar, the stalwart such as Dr. Ambedkar, did it translate to action when he was part of the drafting of the Constitution. Among the first documents which I think merits reading is the Motilal Nehru Committee Report of 1928. And in this particular document, which is actually referred to extensively in the book, in this landmark book and the celebrated book called Framing of India's Constitution, authored by B. Shivarao, and which was published in 1967. All the documents which relate to the drafting of the Constitution have been captured in that. I'll read out certain excerpts from the Madras Congress resolution of 1927, which was an all-party conference and which was actually convened to draft the Constitution of an independent India. Because you have to see that the Home Rule movement effectively started in 1889. From there, the freedom, let's say, campaigners, so to speak, moved towards a position of dominion status for India under the British Commonwealth, under the British Crown. And from there, thanks to more aggressive voices, they decided that we are not even going to be happy with the dominion status. We are going to ask for complete independence and therefore Purna Swaraj. And so they started asking themselves, if we are ultimately looking at a completely independent India, then what is our position going to be with respect to all these societal issues, and what should be the basic position that the Constitution takes with respect to these issues? So here, this committee that was headed by Motilal Nehru, it put together this basic report, which is known as the Nehru Report, and most people confuse it to be the Jawaharlal Nehru Report. Jawaharlal Nehru never drafted any such thing. His father drafted, but he never drafted it. And here, even when this report was being drafted by Mr. Nehru, Motilal Nehru, he was still basing this on a dominion status with a fully responsible government. And here he makes the point, the fundamental rights provided under it, this is how they refer to caste. All citizens, and please note at the word that it says, in the Commonwealth of India, not the Republic of India, in the Commonwealth of India. The word Commonwealth has a very specific significance because it refers to those Commonwealth of nations which operate under the British Crown. So if you were to treat India as part of the Commonwealth, then effectively you see it as part of the continuum of the British legacy, which is how this document was drafted in 1927, 1928. All citizens in the Commonwealth of India have the right to free elementary education, without any distinction of caste or creed. This is the first time that a document which is slowly moving towards the drafting of an Indian constitution refers to the word caste. Now, what you will see here is that it says that free elementary education shall be provided without any distinction of caste or creed, which is to say that you shall not discriminate on the basis of caste or creed. But it still doesn't start with the basic notion that caste as a social organization, as a social construct, must be abolished. So the next document which I think would be very relevant is a white paper issued in 1933. Now, in this case, reservations were actually discussed in this particular document in 1933, primarily in the context of Muslims and not for the scheduled castes. And that is when Dr. Ambedkar decided to make the argument that if you have chosen to give a certain reservational status to Muslims because they are minorities and their concerns have to be addressed, why are you not extending the same consideration to scheduled castes? Because our societal position, our let's say economic position, and our political cloud is much worse than that of the Muslims, and Muslims have ruled this particular country at some point. Therefore, their position is better than ours. The scheduled castes cannot claim to be even at par with the Muslims of this particular country. We are even worse, and therefore he starts talking about these aspects. So, 1933, a white paper was issued by the British to outline their proposals for constitutional reforms in India, and after certain amendments by the Joint Parliamentary Committee, these proposals were incorporated as part of the Government of India Act of 1935, which is the legislation that governed India before the Independence Act of 1947 and before India became independent. In fact, the Government of India Act of 1935 also happens to be the master document from which a significant amount of inspiration was taken by Dr. Ambedkar to put in place all those provisions with respect to administration, with respect to center-state relations, which currently form part of the Constitution of 1949, which was adopted on the 26th of January 1950. Sorry, which was adopted on the 26th of November 1949 and came into force on the 26th of January 1950. In fact, during the course of the the Constituent Assembly debates, certain allegations were even made against Dr. Ambedkar to the extent of saying that what is so different about the Constitution of India when you seem to have copy-pasted stuff and practically lifted stuff from the Government of India Act of 1935. Therefore, the Government of India Act of 1935 is a very, very critical document. And if you wish to understand the Constitution better, it is important for you to understand the Government of India Act also better. Under this Government of India Act of 1935, a certain concept called a communal award was basically introduced. And what this translated to was separate electorates for various minorities in India, such as Muslims, Sikhs, Harijans, and scheduled castes. And please remember that here the words Harijans and scheduled castes are not necessarily being used interchangeably. And when this particular communal award was introduced by the British as part of this act, there was a lot of opposition from two different parties, primarily the Congress Party, which released resolutions denouncing this particular communal award to say that if you introduce a communal award, you're effectively creating a fault line in the Indian society, and it will lead to a situation where one faction of the society and another faction of the society will constantly fight with each other for greater benefits under the government. Therefore, this is an extremely mischievous act on the part of the British, was the primary position of the Congress at that point. Then the second document that I think you should look at is the resolution of the Central Assembly of the Constituent Assembly in 1937. Here, if I may, I'll just show you the relevant portion. In fact, this is not necessary. So the position of the Congress on the nature of the communal award and the manner in which it was bound to foster and foment, let's say, communalism in this country and competitive communalism in this country, where people would be fighting for greater entitlements on the basis of caste or religion, was represented by Mr. Satyamurthy on behalf of the Congress in 1937. The next most important document is the draft constitution that was presented by, and that was actually prepared by Sri B.N. Rao, the constitutional advisor to the Constituent Assembly. So here I'll give a short background, and I've said this in multiple places before, and this is public knowledge. Most people assume that the constitution was drafted by Dr. Ambedkar. It was not drafted by Dr. Ambedkar. So here is the sequence of events on the basis of which the constitution was drafted. Multiple committees, at least 4 different committees, were set up by the Constituent Assembly to look at various aspects of the Constitution, or to undertake, let's say, a scholarly study and to collect stakeholder information from various people. And each of these, let's say, institutions, I'm so sorry, yeah. And each of these reports, each of these committees decided to come out with reports on fundamental rights, on the rights of minorities, and on center-state relations, so on and so forth. Once these committees decided to come out with their reports, on the basis of the consensus and on the basis of comments of each of these committees, a draft constitution was prepared by Sri Benegal Narsingh Rao, who was the constitutional advisor. He presented his first draft on, I think, the 21st of February 1948. He presented it in October 1947, and from October 1947 until February 1948, the drafting committee of the Constituent Assembly decided to revise all the provisions of the draft constitution presented by B.N. Rao. Now, this drafting committee of the Constituent Assembly was a 7-member committee, and out of these 7 members, one of the members was Dr. Ambedkar, who was elected as the chairman of the drafting committee by the members of the committee, by the rest of the 6 members. So, the sum and substance of it being, the first draft of the constitution was prepared by Sri B.N. Rao based on the comments received from various subcommittees and their reports and their stakeholders. This draft was revised by the drafting committee of the Constituent Assembly. Then what do? They decide to present this particular draft to the president of the Constituent Assembly, Sri Rajendra Prasad, and the draft is opened up for public comments at least until October 1948. From February 1948 to October 1948, the draft is opened for stakeholder comments, and people from across the country, lawyers, normal people qualified from the standpoint of, let's say, Shastras, Vedas, and everybody else, chose to comment. And on the basis of the comments received from all these stakeholders, ultimately, certain amendments are proposed to the draft constitution, and the draft constitution, along with the amendments, are introduced for debates in the Constituent Assembly on the 15th of November 1948. So from 15th of November 1948 until the 26th of November 1949 is when the Constituent Assembly debates take place, I think over a course of 155 hearings or 155 sessions, so to speak. So most people, whenever they look at, let's say, the history of the Constitution, they tend to focus exclusively on these debates, when in fact a lot happened prior to the debates, and therein lies a lot of cue and there is a lot of history which informs all the discussions and debates that took place in the Constituent Assembly. So if I were a student of constitutional law, I wouldn't first of all start reading the Constitution by reading the Constitution itself, nor would I start reading the Constitution by reading the Constituent Assembly debates. I would go right back to the Home Rule movement in 1889, start from there and see all the reports that were slowly drafted towards preparing a draft constitution for the country, and then make my way towards 1949 and 1950. So in the outline of the new constitution that was proposed by Sri B.N. Rao, his attempt was to basically strike a compromise between the position of the Congress and the position of the Muslim League, because the Muslim League was effectively saying either we have the concept of, let's say, separate electorates, and if we don't get separate electorates, then we have no other option but to ask for a separate country to protect the interests of the Muslims of the country, namely this creature called Pakistan. That's how the concept of Pakistan was slowly becoming a reality. Now, in this situation, he proposes a certain outline for a future constitution, and a certain number of seats would be allocated to each community as far as this, let's say, this assembly is concerned. And therefore, he says the composition of a certain council, that is of 3 cabinets taken together, are likely to comprise of 6 Hindus other than scheduled castes, 6 Muslims, 1 Sikh, 1 scheduled caste, and 1 Indian Christian. And therefore, the concept of a reservation for minorities and at the very least for scheduled caste was gradually introduced by Sri B.N. Rao as part of his outline to the constitution itself. One of the documents that I think makes for a stellar reading on this particular issue is the preliminary notes on fundamental rights, which was prepared by B.N. Rao as well as K.T. Shah between September and December 1946. And I'll just read out a few aspects here before I go to the rest of the provisions of the Constitution. The state shall promote with special care the educational and economic interests of the weaker sections of the people, and in particular of the scheduled castes and the aboriginal tribes, and shall protect them from social injustice and all forms of exploitation. Now, here is something that you must note. If the state has decided who shall be treated as scheduled castes, and you choose to protect their identity, and you also protect them from exploitation on the basis of their identity, it is impossible for the state to not recognize the identity of the others who are not scheduled castes. So if you want to recognize the caste identity of the scheduled castes, you also have to recognize the identity of other people, because otherwise it will be completely incongruous. You will not be able to distinguish who is who. If you want to recognize B, you have to recognize other than B as well. No individual or corporation shall be permitted to found, support, or maintain any institution of public utility or social service like a school, college, library, hospital, well, tank, canal, whose use is restricted on any ground of caste, creed, community, sex, or color. So if you read each of these provisions, every attempt has been made to actually do away with the concept of discrimination on the basis of caste, distinction on the basis of caste, but still there is no attempt to do away with caste itself as an identity. Then, of course, you have an advisory committee which is set up on the 24th of January 1947. And the intention of the formation of this particular committee was spelled out by Sri Govind Vallabh Pant. And here's where I'd like to read out certain portions from his own statements. We find that in our country, we have to take particular care of the depressed classes, the scheduled castes, and the backward classes. We have to atone for our omissions. I won't use the word commissions. We must do all we can to bring them up to the general level. And it is a real necessity, as much in our interest as in theirs, that the gap should be bridged. The strength of the chain is measured by the weakest link of it. And so until every link is fully revitalized, we will not have a healthy body politic. I hope this advisory committee will place before itself the ideals for which humanity has worked, so on and so forth. Now, if you look at the sentiment expressed by Sri Govind Vallabh Pant as part of his recommendations, it is not at loggerheads with what Dr. Ambedkar was arguing for, and it was certainly not at loggerheads with other Dalit voices and other SC/ST voices which are emerging at that particular point of time. So whenever we think of the Dalit discourse in this country, we only refer to Dr. Ambedkar, we constantly refer to his work. There is no doubt that his work needs to be referred to because of his erudition, his scholarly statements, and his blunt talk. But the other person that most people are perhaps not even aware of is Sri M.C. Raja, who was a Dalit activist, a Dalit Hindu activist from the then Madras Presidency, which we know as, let's say, Tamil Nadu for all practical purposes. He came from Trichy. Now, this gentleman, when he was asked his position with respect to caste, and he was asked of his position with respect to Hinduism, he differed with Dr. Ambedkar to actually make the point that as far as I am concerned and as far as my people are concerned, we are not fighting for destruction of Hinduism, nor are we fighting for destruction of the Hindu identity, nor are we fighting for conversion away from the Hindu identity. All we are asking for is that we be given the same amount of respect under the caste system as everybody else, and that we are not treated as subhumans, and we are not treated as people who are not worthy of respect. So our entire fight is not to break away from this religion called Hinduism. In fact, we are Hindus and we are proud Hindus. All we are asking for is that we too have access to this pride called Hindu pride. It was the blunt statement that was being made by others also. Unfortunately, the entire Dalit discourse, the entire discourse surrounding caste is now relegated to only those people who speak of Dr. Ambedkar. But there were several people other than Dr. Ambedkar from the very same community who were more than happy to present their positions, which were at slight variance with Dr. Ambedkar. All of them agreed on one common thing, which is to say that we deserve greater respect, and there is a certain amount of injustice that has been done to us and that needs to be remedied. But while some were effectively pushing for the destruction of the Hindu identity, there were other voices who were effectively saying, we do not want the Hindu identity to be destroyed, and we don't want to give up our Hindu identity. Anybody who is offering us conversions to give up our Hindu identity, citing this practice as a caste, is asking us to give up our mother, and we are not in a position to do so. We will not do so, was the blunt statement and candid statement made by a lot of people. I don't see how many people are actually aware of even these kind of statements that have been made in the context of the caste discourse in this country. We seem to have been exposed to only certain people, certain individuals and their points of view. There is a lot more to the caste discussion than that has been exposed. So these are certain documents. So what I'll do is that I will share a note with the organizer of this particular event, Mr. Anand Kumar, a note that has been prepared by my research team and where we have had an opportunity to actually work on these issues so that people can read this and understand the history of caste better. So before I open the floor for question and answers, I would suggest that you look at the constitution on the issue of caste as having 2 or 3 baskets. The first basket prohibits untouchability, abolishes untouchability and prohibits discrimination on the basis of caste. And therefore, you're looking at Articles 15, Article 14, Article 17, Articles 25. Then you have the specific definition for scheduled castes, which actually is captured in Article 341. Now, if you look at the definition of scheduled caste under Article 341, something interesting happens. And this is where my Jati Varna discussion becomes extremely relevant, because here it basically says that the president may, with respect to any state or union territory, and where it is a state, after consultation with the governor thereof by public notification, specify the castes, races, or tribes, or parts of, or groups within castes, races, or tribes, which shall, for the purposes of this constitution, be deemed to be scheduled castes in relation to that state or union territory, as the case may be. Now, the point I'm trying to make is, obviously that means certain jatis have been classified as SCs or STs, or SCs for the purposes of Article 341, and which jatis may occupy the position of scheduled caste is dependent on what the president says with respect to, based on his consultation with the governor. Therefore, scheduled caste as a basket is supposed to be a fluid basket, where people can keep coming in and going out depending on their socio-economic status at a given point of time in history. So unfortunately, what has happened over, let's say, the last few decades, or let's say since the inception of the Constitution, is that we have come to believe, somebody has switched on their mic, and thank you. So what we have come to believe in the last 73 to 74 years is that scheduled caste in itself translates to a specific identity. No, scheduled caste is effectively a basket, and it's a revolving door where people can enter and where people can also exit. So if there is a power of notification under Article 341, which the president enjoys as far as which community becomes a scheduled caste, it also translates to the power of denotification also. Unfortunately, we have only seen notification, we have seen greater notification, but we have not seen denotification of any caste. In the recent past, of course, certain communities from Tamil Nadu have themselves made a request to the central government and as well as to the state government that they be denotified as scheduled castes. So I think this particular development is a unique development and may hold the key for a much more open discussion with respect to both caste as well as caste-based reservation in the future. Because I don't think reservation as a certain tool of affirmative action has lost its relevance. I am someone who consciously believes that caste-based reservation perhaps continues to have some kind of value in contemporary Indian society, because there is a certain amount of discrimination that we continue to see on the basis of caste. My only disagreement with the manner in which this particular system has been interpreted and employed is that the mode of reservation is not the sole propriety of any particular community. If there is a certain community that has now climbed the social ladder, it must at least have the grace and the courtesy to give up reservations so that those who have gone down the social ladder have an opportunity to take advantage of these benefits and schemes and climb up the social ladder. So I would say that as opposed to doing away with the concept of reservation altogether, perhaps it may make sense to use socio-economic criteria as opposed to historic criteria, which perhaps doesn't have too much of verification at this point of time and too much of confirmation at this point of time. You use socio-economic criteria and you ask yourself, in the current period for a certain, let's say for the foreseeable future, which community is expected to satisfy the definition of a scheduled caste based on its socio-economic metrics? If it is at the bottommost rung of the ladder, isn't that the community that deserves this particular ladder in order for it to climb up the social hierarchy? This, I think, is perhaps the way of the future. In fact, I even happened to make a statement in one of my public lectures previously, that just as the Prime Minister has experimented with the giving up of, let's say, LPG subsidies, as opposed to abolishing the concept of caste-based reservations, why not consider a situation where certain communities voluntarily give up, let's say, reservations if they realize that their members have benefited enough and that the object of providing reservations to members of their community has been achieved, and therefore others must have an opportunity to enjoy those benefits or at least avail of those benefits, because the word enjoyment seems like a privilege. Reservation is not a matter of privilege. Reservation is a matter of necessity. So I think this is something that we may want to start discussing. I'm sorry that this particular subject happens to be a huge convergence of history, civilization, religion, and constitution. So 30-35 minutes may not be sufficient, or at least I'm not in a position to address this issue and cover all its bases in 30-35 minutes. So I'm happy to address questions. So I now open the floor for questions, and Anand, please moderate the questions.
Thank you very much, Saiji, for this wonderful presentation. We have opened a Pandora box, and we are waiting to see how our participants are going to ask the questions. And just giving them some time, I will just finish my closing remarks and start with the APLC's APLC. As you rightly mentioned, this is a very diverse topic which needs a lot of introspection. This is specifically from the point of view of socio-economic and political aspects. There are certain gray areas which you have rightly touched upon, and the areas which were understood by the common people in a wrong sense. In fact, there are generally accepted points which most of us agree on caste or reservation, but there are specific terms which we actually need to introspect, at least in this year of 2020, where we find there are a lot of avenues opening up for people in getting equal opportunity in all realms of life. And in fact, I was very happy that you rightly mentioned about our great MC Raja, who was on par with Dr. Ambedkar, and he had the same stature of Dr. Ambedkar, but often forgotten, and at least in the sense often neglected in the even in the parts of Tamil Nadu, at least in the parts of South India, so the so-called Madras Presidency, which includes all the other South Indian states as well. It was very important to actually analyze the points that have been shared by other people, other founding fathers of our constitution, what were their views, and how it is important that the other aspects are also to be considered by the government. We were promised in 2014 by the new government certain points which are still in consideration, or maybe we can think which are still in the process of finalization, and I am sure this will take lot more years to see the light of the day. And with this, I move to the next set of questions, next segment, which is called APLC's APLC. It is Ask the Popular Learned Council. So we have prepared a few questions from our end, and if you are ready, I will start with the first one.
Yes, please.
Yes. During your presentation, you covered a key point, and I would like to touch upon it. Let us assume for a minute that Mr. X is coming under general category, and for no mistake of his, why Mr. X has to bear or carry the burden of the so-called wrongdoings of his ancestors?
See, I don't think the issue of caste is to be addressed from an individual perspective. So let me give you a simple example. Assume for a moment that a certain community is being given the benefit of being treated as refugees in India because they're being persecuted for their religion or for their identity in any other country. Do you think it would be right on our part to ask every member of that particular community if they have suffered persecution because of their individual identity? I don't think it would be right to undertake an exercise where every person is asked, please tell me, have you been persecuted on an individual basis? some of these discussions and some of these questions are addressed at a community level, and therefore the idea cannot be to reduce it to the present alone, because the fact remains that present is the child of the past, and at some stage it has a direct nexus to the past, and the current situation has some kind of a nexus to the past. I'm not saying that let us judge the past on the basis of the present, but to say that the present has no relationship to the past would be completely incorrect. So if somebody asks me, can you please tell me why should Indians, or let's say certain members of the general category, bear the brunt of reservations when they are not responsible for the wrongdoings in any manner? Then I have to ask this question: what is your understanding of history? Can Britishers of the current generation not be asked any questions on the basis of the conduct of their ancestors? Can we not talk about racism on the basis of what their ancestors did? Are we supposed to completely give these people a clean sheet altogether? So I don't think it makes sense to say that a member of the current generation should not pay any price. The member of the current generation is not paying the price for any wrongdoings which he may have committed. But the fact is, as a community, since a position has been taken and since an act has been committed or omitted in the past, whenever you look at community justice and whenever you look at community affirmative action, it is not the lens of inquiry is never individual. The lens of inquiry is always based on groups. If you do not do this, you will never be in a position to address any issue where either injustice or persecution has happened on the basis of community. Assume for a moment that I were to accept your argument completely. I can never say that, let's say, as an Indian, and because of my complexion, I have suffered racism in a certain jurisdiction, unless and until I'm able to show that I have been specifically targeted by racism. I will never be able to say my community has suffered racism, because the question that will be asked of me is, are you directly affected by racism? Is there a direct instance of racism in your life? That then, in effect, what happens is we conflate the frame of inquiry. When you look at reservation, when you look at persecution, when you look at injustice, you are certainly looking at a community level argument. There are individual level persecution based arguments and there are community level arguments. Reservation and caste is obviously a community based argument. Consider this: if caste as an identity is not an individual identity, but is an individual identity as a consequence of you being a part of a certain community, how can you escape the consequences which visit on a certain community one way or the other way? If caste is meant to be a group identity, then the consequences of the group identity are also group in nature, whether it is reservation or otherwise. Okay? So it makes very little sense for somebody to say, my ancestors did something, therefore why should I bear the price for it? Your ancestors held a certain caste identity, you also hold a certain caste identity. The caste identity of the person who suffered is a direct consequence of the ancestors, or let's say the identity held by his ancestors, and the oppression that he has suffered is also because of the ancestors' identity only. So I think it makes very little sense to confuse and conflate the individual and the community perspectives on this particular issue. Next.
Thank you, Mr. Sai. But with due respect, I would just like to weigh in here.
Please.
People often get confused with Varnashrama Dharma and caste, which is not in accordance to me is equivalent.
Correct.
Don't you think we are misguided by this Macaulay style of education, where we are forced to feed that Varnashrama Dharma and caste is one and the same? And don't you think if we are knowing the difference, we would stand a better chance to at least minimize the difference in which the rate of difference which is present, which is prevalent right now?
It's not about education, frankly speaking. It is more about understanding our own history. And we seem to be attempting to understand our history in the language of the foreigner, in the language of the invader, in the language of the colonizer, as opposed to understanding our history in our own language. The day we start understanding our histories in our own language, there is a decent chance that we will even unearth the mischief that has been committed using our history and manufacturing our history by others who had a vested interest in projecting us and portraying us as some kind of a savage community, as some kind of a barbaric community, as some kind of a casteist and classist community. This is a community that has traversed a journey of nothing less than 7,000 to 8,000 years. And therefore, when someone says that the entire history of this particular community's journey is rife with casteism, is riddled with casteism. I refuse to buy that argument because I have not seen any evidence, nor is it logically consistent. Point number two, Macaulay did his mischief because he had a specific intention. But what is it that the Indian government has done since 1949, since 1947, at least when the constitution was being drafted, to undertake an effort to revisit, let's say, the history of caste, to understand caste from a better perspective, as opposed to relying on foreign sources, as opposed to relying on the colonizers' sources to understand our own history? I don't understand. When somebody comes and asks you your identity, will you ask the neighbor to craft your identity, or will you ask your own parents to craft your identity? So when it comes to the history of this particular country, language also is an issue. And I'm told that my video has a problem. Are you able to see me, Anand?
No, sir. Actually, I just didn't want to interrupt. I just thought let you finish this answer and then I'll tell you. The video is frozen actually. Yeah.
I'm so sorry. There was a bit of an issue with my laptop. Yes.
I didn't want to interrupt. Yeah.
Okay. So yes. So the point is that as long as we don't undertake an effort to alter, or let's say to revisit our history and to present it in our languages and to present it through our perspectives, we will always look at our own history from a self-loathing perspective. I'm not saying let us whitewash all the problems with our history, let us whitewash everything that was perhaps indefensible as far as our history is concerned. But we must avoid falling into the trap of presentism, which is to say, judging the past on the anvils of the present is never ever going to show the past in good light. And as a process, as a consequence of which, you will always have, let's say, a sort of a complex when you look at your past, and you will continue to believe that you are an inheritor of, let's say, a savage civilization or an inherently caste civilization, which is as far from the truth as it gets. Let me be very, very blunt, and I borrow words from some of my friends who are better informed than me. Everything of ancient India, which continues to survive, right from temples to monuments to everything, is the contribution of the Shudra. The Shudras have built this country. The Shudras are single-handedly responsible for everything of beauty that this country has seen. And unfortunately, we don't understand the concept of Shudra. We don't understand who's part of the particular community. Everything, right from every monument, everything that has been chiseled and carved and sculpted is the contribution of the Shudra of this country. That is a fact. And we rob them of their respect. We rob them of their dignity by constantly telling them that your ancestors were never given a place of dignity and they were constantly oppressed and crushed. This is as far from the truth as it gets. Okay, there may have been certain instances in certain phases of our history where certain communities were subjected to oppression, but that is true of even today, and that is true of every society where somebody who's in a position of power will constantly try to hold on to that particular position, and there'll always be someone who's at the receiving end of that particular power structure and the power imbalance. However, to say that somebody has been at the same situation for 7,000 years is ahistoric and is completely illogical. This is something that we must try and understand. The more we read our own histories in our own languages through people who have actually taken the pains to correct all of it. See, unfortunately, I haven't seen too many books on history which have been translated from Bengali and Tamil and presented to students of history. It's somebody who's, books which have been authored in Columbia, books which have been authored in Stanford, books which have been authored in Harvard that are being presented to Indians, as opposed to books that ought to be translated from native languages.
Yes, sir. Thank you. But we were promised of a new changeover in the subject syllabus when the new government was formed, but we are yet to see the light of the day. So don't you think
the national education policy, I don't think has done justice to that particular issue. That particular expectation continues to be on the back burner. While the national education policy, to be fair and to give credit to the government, is certainly a way forward compared to where we are today, it certainly changes the status quo for the better to some extent. I believe that more could have been done, and as a citizen, I certainly have the right to expect that more ought to have been done, given that we are trying to address a rapidly moving problem with a couple of band-aids. Okay, the rate at which the problem is making its presence felt in multiple areas is not the rate at which the solution is equally making its presence felt. Okay, I understand that perhaps 7 years or 6 years is too short a period to see a certain amount of reform with respect to a situation that is the product of 70 years of consistent effort, or even more than that. It's not just 70 years. All our history, including our caste history, the identification of caste-based certification, is the product of at least 150 years, since it is the product of the British man's invention. Okay. Now, I believe that as to addressing it only from the standpoint of, let's say, changing the language, the one thing that I've also said based on, let's say, statements made by other experts on education, is that it's not enough to change the language or the medium of education. It is equally important to revive your Indic schools of education, your own Indic forms of education. Unless and until you do that, whatever you try, whatever you do, you are continuing the convent medium of education that was introduced by the British man. There is no difference. Okay. You have not gone back to your style of teaching. You have not gone back to understanding what are your schools of philosophy, what are the Indian darshanas. Nobody, in fact, has been exposed to that in India until after their schooling years, by which time they've already formed an opinion that Indian schools of philosophy are marginal schools of philosophy that are to be read for ornamental purposes and for the purposes of showing off, but they have no practical relevance, they have no contemporary purchase, they are not in a position to be applied to our current day problems. As long as you treat these as mere showpieces on the mantles of your civilization without actually implementing them, you will suffer from a situation where you're trying to address indigenous problems through a foreign solution, which is never the case. There is a serious lack of originality on this particular front.
Thank you, Mr. Sai. Now moving on to the next question. Let me be frank here. In Upward YouTube channel, 2 days back, you were talking about the Hindus moving out of India for greener pastures, leaving behind their homeland. And there was a point that that we were discussing about the dominion domination of the other religion. So in fact, with due respect, I feel, whereas the fact is most of the people were forced to move out of India because of reservation. The opportunity was snatched from them and they were forced to move out of India for greener pastures.
I see. Okay, so I have to really ask this question. Why are you and I in India still? Is it because we are not in a position to go to any other foreign country? Are we any less qualified to go to any other foreign country? Why are we here still?
We have other reservations to not move out of India. The reasons may not be the same. In fact, I may not want to move out of India. People might have different opinion, but I feel the point which you mentioned on the YouTube channel is that they are moving out of greener pasture and leaving behind their homeland. They are leaving their belongingness towards their homeland. But I beg to differ from your point. Yeah.
Okay, let me try and answer this question from a factual and a statistical perspective. Okay. If it is accepted that the ones who have moved out of this country are largely the Savarnas and the people from, let's say, the forward caste, or let's say the upper caste, or the general categories, so to speak. Okay. That means, as opposed to staying here and trying to change the situation, or as opposed to paying the price for what their ancestors did or did not do, or if they believe that this is based on false history, as opposed to addressing that particular situation, if you choose to abandon this country altogether, that means you have severed your relationship with this particular country and you have chosen to go your own way and decided to carve your own individual destiny altogether, notwithstanding the fact that you continue to want to hold on to this Indian identity. Okay? So I'm sorry to say this, not everybody can have access to that particular justification. See, one of the justifications that actually makes much more sense is that even if I'm qualified from the Indian Institute of Kharagpur or the Indian Institute of Delhi, which was, let's say, Indian Institute of Madras, which was one of the earliest IITs set up in India, unfortunately, India did not have enough opportunities to offer even to those people coming from its best of institutions. Therefore, they went away. So let me try and compare this with another country. Please read the history of this desert state called Israel. Okay, which is 1/50th your size and suffers from acute paucity of water. And in the initial years, they had to transfer water from the Sea of Galilee to Israel. And now that even that source is not existing, which is why they have to go for desalination plants so that they can get water from the sea. Okay. The point I'm trying to make is, every country has its own problems. Okay, every country, especially a complex country such as India, with its own set of issues, with a huge historical baggage, obviously had a lot of problems. But the solution doesn't lie in the so-called brain drain, which we seem to justify on the basis of individual opportunities and paucity of good opportunities in this country. Okay, if you have a problem with reservation, you still have a problem with your own mother. The point I'm trying to make is, if there is a problem within a certain family, the solution is not to abandon that family and run away and continue to claim some kind of nexus to that particular family. If you believe that this is your family, then you must stay back here and address that issue as opposed to leaving this country. Let me also make a further point. Despite this reservation, despite all these reservations, which are now over 50% in quite a few states, and Tamil Nadu itself has 69%, is it our case that Tamil Nadu has not seen development at all in the last 70 years? Is it our case that Tamil Nadu has not seen any kind of industrialization in the last 70 years? Is it our case that there is no talent in India at all? We have managed to achieve a fair bit despite reservations and despite exodus of talent. So frankly speaking, I'm not saying that everybody who has run away this country, has fled this country, is an opportunist. I'm not going to make any such statements. It is certainly great for a country to have a strategic diaspora in multiple countries. I certainly believe in that. At the same time, citing reservations to leave this particular country is to give up your homeland because you feel that it has no hope. I hope anybody who gives that particular justification doesn't come back to celebrate India when India is now under Mr. Modi to say, now India is doing better. India continues to have reservations even under Modi, right? And yet NRIs seem to have a lot of interest in either in coming back in this country or in investing in this country or celebrating the relationship with this country. Okay, so I think reservations are not the problem. Problem was always with the license permit Raj of this country, the Nehruvian socialist model that was followed, the economic policies of the Nehruvian government which are responsible. Reservation is just but one of the issues. Okay. Assume for a moment that from 1947 onwards, or at least from 1952, when the man again became the prime minister after the first general elections, if he had decided to invest in private enterprise, coupled with strategic investment of the government in the public sector, which I certainly give him credit for setting up institutes such as the IITs, for setting up banks, for setting up, let's say, public sector industries which manage certain critical areas in terms of production, where you have a decent marriage between public sector units as well as private enterprise, then educated people would have had better opportunities despite being in India and despite reservations. So the exodus or brain drain is not to be attributed to reservations. It must be attributed to the suffocating practices, economic practices of Mr. Nehru, which continued until 1991. Now let's look at it this way. Post 1991, reservations have not gone down. They've actually gone up, right? Today, you're looking at further reservations, plus you have a general category reservation as well at 10% after the 103rd Amendment. So despite these reservations, what is it that has changed? After 1991, the fact remains that we have become a liberalized economy because we were pushed to the level of beggary and bankruptcy, so we decided to mend our ways. Once the market was opened, the economy liberalized, more opportunities for private investment and entrepreneurship started, and therefore the exodus to some extent has certainly come down. Okay, compare the number of people who used to leave the portals of IITs directly for, let's say, an MBA or a GR or let's say or an MS and settle in the US, and the number of people who are willing to stay in this country. This is a time where you're seeing a lot of people from the Indian Institutes of Technology or AIIMS joining the civil services also, right? Despite reservations in civil services also, right? So I don't think that reservations is the reason that must be blamed for any kind of brain drain. It may have been one of the reasons, but the primary reason are our larger socio-economic policies, the existence of a draconian license permit, Raj, nothing else.
Thank you, Saiji. But I still beg to differ. A person may avail benefit in the aspect of job or in the aspect of education.
Right.
A person is given privilege in both the fields. And in fact, right, the second point which I would like to tell here is we cannot take away the credit away from Mr. Nehru, because in fact he was the person who built the temples of modern India, even though the temples may have defoliated of late. But now the question remains is, we are talking about people cracking the civil service exams here, but they are only the creamiest layers of the best of the lot, right? The person in the general category may not always be the best person and may not always score 99 or 99.5 every time. There may be a person who may be average or below average, but
Right.
he has been deprived of that, right? And only those creamy layers of the best are getting opportunity in civil services or in other government examinations here. So that is why most of the people, I am not generalizing here or giving my opinion here, but because of these kinds of reasons, people tend to actually move out for better pastures.
See,
Please correct me if I'm wrong.
see, let me also clarify this. I don't believe that I'm 100% right. And on these matters, it's a matter of opinion. And it's a matter of marshalling facts to support each other's positions. So I don't remotely believe that I'm 100% right. Okay. All I'm trying to say is please consider this, that if your argument is that people who belong to the creamy layer of either the backward classes or the SC/STs must no more consider themselves as being entitled to reservation. In principle, I completely agree with you on that particular argument. That is still not an argument against reservation. That is an argument against excluding, or let's say that's an argument in support of excluding the creamy layer from reservation. There I really don't have an issue. Okay. Let me say something which could provoke a lot of let's say hate mails against me, but since I'm known for being blunt, I might as well go all out and make this point. If the SC/STs really want to benefit from the constitutional scheme envisaged by the framers of the Constitution, the backward classes, the so-called backward classes and the landowning communities are the ones who must stop clamoring for reservations. Okay? Because the quota of reservations is being crowded by those who have a lot of political clout, thanks to their numbers, thanks to the fact that they are landowning communities, and a recent judgment of the Supreme Court, such as the Maratha reservation judgment, is something that is a lesson for all of us to try and understand as to how certain communities which have significant representation in politics, significant representation in public services, significant representation in owning of real estate, ultimately now claim reservations and end up making a mockery of that very system in the first place. Okay, an instance of abuse of the system by certain vested interests do not prove any point against the need for that particular system. They only show that the safeguards which are required to prevent the system from being abused are not in place or are not being implemented. Okay, and the fundamental problem with reservations, if I were you, I would argue it slightly differently to basically say, is that reservation creates a certain amount of competitive greed in many communities where everyone tries to avail of that particular benefits. Okay, and which is precisely why, to prevent the politician from using caste arithmetic to create reservations in favor of political communities which ultimately form power blocks or vote blocks, certain guidelines and certain metrics have been laid down by the judiciary to ensure that ultimately only the right entity or the right community gets reservations. Unfortunately, what has happened is everybody has benefited at the expense of the people who are entitled to reservations and for whom reservations have been designed. Okay, the reason why you cannot speak out against this particular issue, and no government will have the political will to actually speak against this particular issue, because you're speaking against perhaps the most powerful communities in the country who have money, who have presence, who have political support, and who have lobbies across the country. That is a fact. Okay, and therefore the weak and the unrepresented and the numerically poor Savarnas who are at the top of the so-called caste hierarchy but are certainly not at the top of the social hierarchy are constantly cited as scapegoats for other communities to constantly seek reservations. Okay, I will go a step further. Since you are from Tamil Nadu, you will understand this even better. Okay, the Justice Party movement as well as the self-respect movement was predominantly an anti-Brahmin movement and not a pro-Dalit movement or a pro-SC/ST movement. And the reason is certain communities from Tamil Nadu had a problem with the fact that the Brahmins of Tamil Nadu learnt English and had occupied certain positions under the British government. And therefore, Since they wanted to claim equal proximity with the British government, they decided to start a certain movement which was predominantly populated by other communities who were forward castes, non-Brahmin forward castes, but certainly not Dalits or depressed classes by any sense of the word. And since you're from Tamil Nadu, Mr. Periyar, E.V. Ramaswamy Naidu, also comes from a non-Brahmin forward class community who had no right to speak on behalf of the Dalits, but who ultimately decided to start a politically convenient movement in the name of Dalits, and he constantly spewed venom against the Dalits. If anything, after the advent of Dravidianism in Tamil Nadu, there have been more attacks against the Dalits by landed communities, by the MBCs and BCs. Unfortunately, nobody wants to talk about it because we are very clearly going to take position against Brahminism, but we don't want to talk about others who have created trouble in the name of Brahminism, but who have chosen to champion themselves as champions of social justice, as champions of egalitarianism and equality. Okay, so therefore, barring certain islands of honesty, the discussion around caste, the discussion around caste politics, and the discussion around reservation is completely manufactured, is completely based on political correctness, and is based on political opportunism and social opportunism. Okay, the fact remains that the Dalits and the SC/STs continue to be at the bottommost rung of the ladder, except for certain people and a handful of people who have benefited from the reservations and who are unwilling to let others benefit from the reservations. And as a consequence of which, two people have suffered. The poor Dalit as well as the poor Savarna, both of them are left out from the reservation, and the creamy layers from both these categories, or the creamy layer from the other category and the landed community from the non-Brahmin category, are the ones who have benefited extensively from this. Okay, if somebody wants to cite my caste and my caste identity to say that my reasons for holding these views are my caste, I'm more than happy to take that person on, because I'm happy to discuss facts. I really don't have a problem with it. Okay, so see, at the end of the day, I can only run away from facts so much. But the moment I present facts and the moment I say, here are the facts, now you confront me and you tell me my position is based on a conflict of interest, I'm more than happy to address it. Unfortunately, Periyar has been celebrated as some kind of a social reformer, and he has been put in the same class as Dr. Ambedkar. Ambedkar was leagues ahead of Periyar. Periyar was someone who even wanted a separate nation altogether and who wanted to destroy the concept of India, who wanted to burn the Indian flag on the eve of the independence, of Indian independence, and who felt that it was the black tape perhaps for the Tamils of this country. So unfortunately, we have created certain false idols and certain false role models, and we have covered them in the sheen and glory of social justice and equality when they never stood for anything which is social justice or equality.
Excellently put, Mr. Sai. In fact, I was a little bit hesitant to actually keep this topic, because people always go and do this kind of the so-called research about the person's caste and other categories. In fact, I was a bit, in fact, even my friends told me, because the moderator is from certain caste, my moderator and the speaker are from certain caste, definitely people will actually start criticizing about the topic that I have chosen for this 25th webinar. But I actually went ahead because I wanted to bring clarity. And in fact, people were misled continuously by this Justice Party and the so-called Dravidian DK, Dravidar Kadagam. In fact, they did a reverse engineering, according to me, as to who should not come and occupy the seat or the seat of power or position, because they were having this anti-Brahminical stand, and they ensured that Brahmins did not or were not allowed to occupy these positions.
In fact, to address that, let me go a step further and break a few myths. One, Brahmins are equally the citizens of this country, and they have a right to their opinions, they have a right to their way of life, and they have a right to practice their form of life, and they have a right to express their opinion as well. Free speech and free expression are equally available to the Brahmins. And if somebody says that because you're a Brahmin, you must keep your mouth shut, I'm sorry, I will not under any circumstances. Because if that is the argument, then I'm sorry, I can't be worse off than certain people who have invaded this particular community and who are responsible for the persecution of this land. Okay, I'm certainly better off compared to those people. Nobody can take away my right to speak on these issues, which is why I said, when people invite me for certain talks, they should be ready for certain provocative comments, because unlike others who beat around the bush, I hit the nail on the head because I know what I'm really talking about. And on these facts, the most important fact is several celebrated non-Brahmin, let's say, caste reformers are, let's say, I can draw from their works and support my position, because they have established that the Brahmin has been made the scapegoat in the so-called Dravidian movement to further the opportunistic politics of the Dravida Kazhagam and its offspring. Okay, the biggest virus to have infected Indian politics, according to me, is the politics of Dravidianism, and every institution that swears by the ideology of Dravidianism, because they are single-handedly responsible for pushing several sections of the Hindu society into the hands of other communities and for creating an army of anti-Indians and anti-Hindus.
Yes, sir, and that is precisely the reason why we actually wanted to have you. We wanted to go and hit the nail on the coffin. And in fact, moving on to adding one more point, the sad reality is Brahmins are nowadays only confined to the freedom of, only confined to their free speech in the social media alone. They are not ready to come up and be vocal on other issues.
See, this is something that is, I've spoken on in a couple of places, both in private spaces as well as in public places. The role of a Brahmin in a Hindu society is to uplift everybody else in the Hindu society. So when you fight for the Brahmin identity, unlike others, you're not fighting for your survival. You're not fighting for the survival of your identity alone. You're fighting for the survival of Hindu Dharma. That is a fact. However, as long as your claim of being a Brahmin is at loggerheads with your conduct, there is no reason why people must take you seriously or respect you. Okay? Brahminism and Brahmin is not a caste identity. It is the identity of a certain class of people who are meant to be educated in Dharma, who are meant to be trained in Dharma, who are meant to be protectors of the Veda, who are meant to be protectors of the Vedic way of life. And the first requirement of being a Brahmin is certainly not parentage, but character. Okay? Therefore, a lot of people who came to be Brahmins can be Brahmins because of parentage, but frankly speaking, if you were to apply the most rigorous sense of the word, they may not be practicing Brahmins. So Twitter Brahmins or Brahmins everywhere else can shout from the rooftops, but the only way you will convince others is by following the way of life that has been prescribed to you by the Shastras, which means you effectively submit and surrender to Goddess Saraswati and ensure that others follow the path. Okay? So I will cite, let's say, Mahapariva, Sri Chandrasekharan Saraswati on this particular point, that the downfall of Hinduism started when the Brahmin decided to leave his traditional vocation and decided to learn English to climb the social ladder, because he had given up what was fundamentally expected of him, which is that you must learn the Vedas, you must teach the Vedas, and you must practice the Vedas. Okay? And you must lead a life of charity, or you must lead a life of poverty. That means that the Brahmin is expected to be poor because he has Devi Saraswati flowing out of his hands. That is precisely why the teacher was expected to be supported by the rest of the society, because he has no other means of survival. As long as these are certain aspects that we are not willing to live by, I don't see how New Age Brahminism can claim the same kind of respect as, let's say, original Brahminism. And you will continue to suffer for that. There is no way that you can run away from that. And because there is a lot of mistakes on your end, you don't have the guts to speak out. Numbers don't matter when it comes to speaking out the truth. The fact is, there is a lot of guilt within our own heads and our own hearts, and that's one of the reasons we are not speaking out. And the guilt is not because we committed atrocities. The guilt is you're not leading the life of a Brahmin. That is a fact.
Yes, sir. In fact, I would like to quote Thiruvalluvar here. In fact, he goes on to say, "Andanar enbor aravor matrevvuyirkum sendanmai poondolugalan." So, Andanar enbor aravor, those who practice or preach or go the way of Dharma, are the real Andanars, are the Brahmins. In fact, nowadays we are required to ask ourselves whether there is actually any Brahmin left here in current society.
Which is why, as I said, the point about Brahmins is not about trying to protect their caste identity. Brahmins are not meant to be clannish about that identity. Their idea is to collect the rest of the Hindu society and to rally the Hindu society. This is something that the missionary realized. This is something that the invader realized. He realized that if these people are eliminated, they are made unpopular and they become the subject of hatred, the Hindu society will automatically fall. Okay, so the rape of Brahmins, the pillage of Brahmins, the destruction of Brahminical institutions, and everything, whether it is done by Periyar or not, has ultimately furthered the missionary agenda, which is the larger agenda that the Hindu society must look out for.
Yes, sir. Thank you. Now, moving on to the next question, which was
This will be the last question because after this I have another. My briefings will start for tomorrow's hearings and the week's hearings, so I'll take this as the last question.
Yes, actually, we actually asked participants to ask questions during the registration itself.
Right.
Mr. Krishnan P has asked a long question. If you could choose to answer a few of them as well. In a secular state, why should Christians and Muslims are called as minorities? There are so many subclasses in Hindus whose population is much lesser than Christians and Muslims in different states, but they do not have any privilege just because they are Hindus. Is it not disparity?
Although this is not strictly related to the theme of this entire session, let me just say that minorities, even if they are supposed to be recognized, are recognized only for the purposes of state-based census and not for national census. That is the law of the land. Second, as far as let's say a secular state is concerned, secular state of course means that the state may or may not have its own religion, but it is not oblivious to the fact that there are certain people who are religious minorities. Existence of minorities or recognition of minorities is not the problem. What is the problem is minority appeasement and minorityism. Okay, and on this particular issue, see, we must actually read the Constituent Assembly debates, where Sri K. M. Munshi makes it abundantly clear, and I think even another framer of the Constitution made it very, very clear, that just as the majority is expected to respect the right of the existence of the minorities must also not hold the majority to ransom by constantly touting the minority card. And therefore, coexistence in the Indian society is contingent on both the majority as well as the minority. The responsibility is not on the majority community alone. That has been said abundantly. What has happened over a point of time is that a section of voices from certain minority communities, not all minority communities, have been constantly pampered by the successive Indian governments, and that has given a lot of belligerence and a lot of confidence that you can get away with anything as long as you cite the minority card in India. Okay, that is what is happening.
Yes, sir. Thank you very much. And I take immense pleasure to announce the names of 3 regular participants who shall be receiving our token of recognition and gratitude. The prizes are sponsored by Takkar Law House, and I take this opportunity to thank them. We have got books written by great men, and we shall be giving it to 3 of our regular participants. It is Advocate Phul Kumari, Delhi High Court, and Miss Saida Ruby Abidi, Government Law College, Mumbai, and Syed Ahmadi Moideen, student of St. Wilfred's College of Law, Navi Mumbai. And sir, as I actually told you earlier, we have actually wanted to give two prizes to people who ask good questions during this presentation.
Right.
So if you could just run through this chat and could just tell me 2 people who have asked good question, which is giving us further scope for discussion or deliberation, it would be great, sir.
Just a second.
Yeah. And I would also be failing in my duty if I do not recognize the participation of Advocate Rakhi Budhiraja, Supreme Court of India, Advocate Lokendra Upadhyay, Delhi High Court, Advocate Yogesh Agarwal, Delhi High Court, Professor Vandana Singh, Amity University, Mr. Krishnan P. Indra Priyadarshini Law College, Prakash Kumar, Jharkhand High Court, Ranchi, Ms. Rama Singh, USA, and Ms. Anu Dubey for their continuous support and participation in most of our webinars.
I think Arjun Sharma's last question at 7:36 p.m. is a good question.
Yes. Okay.
Are reservations implemented at a very late stage of the academic system in India, which explains the drastic difference in cutoffs for exams? If it is applied for pre-primary right up to class with a public sponsor, as generations pass, the cutoffs will increase and the sense of compromised merit will be fixed. I think it's a good question, and it's a solution-based question, which I think is important.
Yes, sir.
So this is one. A slightly provocative question from Mr. Ram Mohan at 7:32, where he asks, only Brahmins represents Hindus. His basic question is, are Brahmins to be treated as a representative of Hindus? I think that's a very good question, and that's something that needs to be taken up. So I would treat both these questions, because one effectively raises a larger question of the relationship between Brahmanism and Hinduism, and the second addresses the question of reservations. Okay, these are the two questions.
Yes, sir. Thank you, participants. I will be connecting with you people, and I will definitely be sending these books to you. And now, with this, I think I take this opportunity to thank our special speaker, Mr. Sai, for coming on board and being frank as always, and hitting the nail in the coffin. And I often admire Mr. Sai for his different kind of approach in all the topics which are given to him, and I sincerely thank him for inaugurating our session, the first session, where we were actually not known to many of us, and again he is coming back on our 25th session to honor us. Sir, few words before we closing remarks before we wrap this session.
First of all, I think you're doing a fantastic job by taking up these issues and giving me an opportunity to present these issues to the legal audience as well as to the non-legal audience. I noticed that there is a significant amount of diversity in the kind of people who are actually watching your talks, which is fantastic. And I would request that it would be great if people could read up on some of these topics on their own through primary sources, as opposed to falling on anybody's views. You are welcome to treat every opinion of mine and every position of mine as incorrect and disagree with me. But the only way you can perhaps argue with me or debate with me is by equipping yourself with the primary source and reading better. That's the only way to do it. There is no point in name dropping, or there is no point in calling somebody this and that or citing authors. The idea must be to ultimately try and read primary sources. And when you're discussing issues such as caste, religion, and the Constitution, it is not enough to read judgments of the Supreme Court or the Constitution or the history of the Constitution alone. It's important to read a lot of literature on the history of this country and on, let's say, the politics of this country. Only then you will be in a much better position to approach these issues from a more realistic perspective. Otherwise, it will always be a dry academic approach, which is never in a position to offer realistic solutions or practical outcomes. So that's all I have to say. Once again, I'm thankful and I'm grateful. I hope I did justice to the opportunity. I wish I could have addressed the issue with greater depth. Unfortunately, I think writing is always a better forum for addressing issues with greater depth than speaking. When we speak, the idea is to introduce the topic and the flavor of the topic to people, so that they're encouraged to read a bit more and then take up the issue on their own, ultimately through their own research. So thank you once again.
Thank you very much, Saiji, for coming on board and attending this webinar. And I, at this juncture, put an obligation to you to come back again and answer all the unanswered questions at least.
I'll do my best. I'll do my best. Thank you.
Yes,
yeah.
Thank you. And thank you all the participants for attending today's session. We have other exciting webinars coming up as well. I request you to kindly follow our Facebook page, AP Legal Chambers, and our YouTube channel, AP Legal Chambers, for getting updates on the latest videos and also on the latest webinars that are happening. I am just leaving the YouTube page in the chat box. You may kindly subscribe to it to see the latest videos, and including this video. And with this, I thank all the participants, and I personally thank the people who are behind me in conducting these webinars. I will be failing in my duty if I do not thank them. There are other people who are slogging more hours than me. I take this opportunity to thank Mr. Kamal, Mr. Arun, Ms. Pallavi, and other people who are slogging day in and day out. And I request you people to kindly subscribe to our channel to actually encourage us to bring more special speakers to our channel. And I thank you all on behalf of my team, AP Legal Chambers, and on behalf of on my personal behalf, it is Anand signing off. Thank you. Jai Hind.